Hello and welcome to today's session on developing reflective students and our own practice in relation to the T level for education and early years. My name is Sarah Dagger and I work on the provider development team at NCFE. Our purpose is to promote and advance learning to create a fairer society. Thank you for joining me today. This is a studio recording of a previously live session delivered as part of the provider development CPD offer to support you in your delivery of the T level. The agenda is on the screen. This event will explore teaching and learning strategies which develop reflective practice in students with a focus on the progression of learning and improving outcomes. It will dive deeper into element 9, reflective practice, and exemplify how reflective practice models can be used to encourage your students to feel part of the learning cycle, taking increased ownership for their learning and being more self-aware and learning to self-regulate. It will also include the opportunity to reflect on our own professional practice. If we're taking the time out today to learn with me, I hope you'll go away with some of your own professional development and some time to reflect on that. And as I alluded to before, the idea of self-regulation for our students, we'll look at the role we have to co-regulate with students to enable them to become independent reflective practitioners who can self-regulate their own progress and development, which is what we hope for all of our students. So I'll ask you this question now, and then I'll ask you to reflect at the end. So where are you now as you sit listening to me? Where's your current confidence score for how you feel about teaching element 9, reflective practice, and embedding that so that your students do become reflective practitioners on their education and early years T level? Maybe you want to make a little note of it, have a think, and then we'll reflect against that at the end of the session. So let's start by thinking about what reflection is, particularly in a work context. The ideas on the screen are those shared from colleagues during the live session. So we've got its practice, change, what went well, what could go even better, strengths and weaknesses. Consider for a moment if these words were what you would have suggested. Do they resonate with you, or would you extend beyond those suggestions? And again, you might want to make a little note now as we go through and continue to add to those personal reflections as you catch up on demand. So reflection or reflective practice is a way for practitioners to turn their reflection into knowledge and develop skills and capability and clarity of thinking. Is how we would look at reflection in an industry. I'm going to put some quotes up on the screen for you now. We've got Finley, who states it is learning from an experience and towards gaining new insights of self-practice. And I think those keywords are learning, experience, and insights really jump out for me on that quote. On the next quote, I'll leave it there for you to read and just comprehend for one moment. Again, here we've got the idea that it's to review and take necessary action. So we've got that idea that it is something that we need to be doing, okay? It's not just going to happen without us taking action ourselves. And then we've got to improve. And again, we've got that idea of teaching and learning goals. And then we've got one final one there. give you a moment again to just read and take that in. And again, I highlight here, it's that actions towards a specific goal and successes and next steps for development. So reflective practice requires you to be objective, to explore what you do, review all aspects of your work and how you can maintain or improve the standards required within your industry context. So for us, it would be education and early years, and also for yourselves as practitioners in that FE learning landscape. Just take a moment. Which resonates with your understanding of reflection in your sector and industry, and which one would you most gravitate towards? And maybe just have a little think. And again, journaling, jotting as we're going through today's session to reflect on where you are at. So reflection in education and childcare, reflection education and early years is acknowledged as crucial to effective practice within teaching. And you can see there on the screen that we've got a number of teaching standards or frameworks where reflection is explicitly referred to and is part of that ongoing professional behaviours and professional development. So within the professional standards for teachers and trainers, it's in the teaching standards, it is in the early careers framework, and it is in for T-level students as well, in that they have an entire element on reflective practice. And as we go through this session, we'll see that it's actually part of their assessment and that ability to reflect. So on the screen, from our live session, the question posed and which we voted and ranked the below benefits was, how have you benefited from reflective practice? And those who were attending ranked the statements, and you can see them now in the order that they came up from most, from the one chosen the most to the one chosen the least, or the most favourable, or the larger benefit. So let's explore these in a little bit more detail. So reflective teaching can help promote your professional growth. Reflective teaching really does help, and the benefits are both in terms of short-term and long-term. You can simply begin with a reflective journal and write down your thoughts after each session. What went well? What would you do differently? What was the outcome? What was your intended outcome? What was the actual outcome? And then you can look at how you can move and change towards your intended goal. You can also use reflective teaching methods to search for innovations on how to improve your teaching methods. Reflective teaching and innovation fully complement each other. So thinking about where you come from, that professional growth, making your lessons more lively and interesting, and enhancing innovation from some of those ideas on the board there. Reflective practice will also ensure that students are benefiting from the learning experience. Motivation is key to a successful learning environment for both the students and the teacher. So engaging your students can improve the overall experience. Teachers really value their relationship with their students. If we want to help our students to understand our teaching methods, it's really important to cultivate positive individual relationships with our students. And reflective teaching practice really help you to think about each student as an individual learner with unique needs. It's that idea of removing any assumptions, isn't it? Okay, about removing assumptions about what attainment is, removing assumptions about what students should be able to do, and viewing each and every one of them as an individual as they come through our classroom door. And why do we need to do that? Because a dull class is every teacher's nightmare. It definitely was mine. I did not want tumbleweed. I wanted interaction. I wanted spark and a little bit of fire about students when I was teaching. And I'm sure you can all reflect back to, think back to a feeling a number of times when you look at the clock through a lesson. Is it nearly break time yet? Because your students perhaps are not engaged and are not sparked by the learning. And to avoid this experience, we can implement some reflective teaching strategies to troubleshoot and liven up the classroom. For example, starting your classes with a refresher session and reviewing what was taught in the last session. And this sort of relationship building by using reflection of how we can improve practice can help in solving problems and help learners to meet challenges effectively and efficiently, which is obviously of the utmost importance to us. Democracy within the class environment also makes it easier for your students to open discussions with you or between themselves, discussing intercultural differences and shared cultural values, which all go towards that innovation, teacher-student relationship, lively lessons, so all those benefits that we get from reflective practice. So now let's have a look at where we might find the reflection in the T level. So I'm sure most would agree that reflection is an important part of the profession that T level students studying the education and early years qualification would need. We should also be recognising that it's part of every student's study skills and a method through which that they can improve their own outcomes. Within the T level, it is an element in itself which shows how important it is to the profession that the students are going into. And it's not just part of that higher order thinking, but that we're going to have to specifically teach and exemplify reflective practice for our T-level students to succeed. And you can see there the main learning core knowledge statements from that element. And we'll unpick those in a little bit more detail. It is also explicit in the ESP for Task 2A. I did mention before that it is taught, that it is part of their assessment. And the ability to reflect efficiently and therefore grow from that reflection will support them in their assessments. So task 2B on the ESP, the students are required to work independently and under supervised conditions to reflect on the feedback received from peers and update their activity plan accordingly. Within that, there will be analysis of what others, their peers in this particular instant, felt would work well in their activity plan, questions they were asked by their peers. So that reflection really is that active listening as well at times to what's being said. They have to identify improvements and then they need to make a summary of changes. So building in that reflection with peers as part of your teaching and learning is really going to support them in their ESP. And again, in task 4, it is a 2-hour a written reflection of their whole ESP, where the students are required to work independently, to carry out reflective practice and review the outcome of their work in relation to the brief. And I think this is a really important one where we're reflecting in relation to a particular scenario and how we grew from that in particular, or how we were successful in achieving that, and that we can focus that reflection. Within that, that's a review of their whole process. They could use reflective models within that. And it's important that for them to be successful, they've got some teaching and learning tips about how to reflect appropriately. For our early year educator students, It is also explicitly part of their assignment 3 part 1, where they are asked to evaluate their strengths and weaknesses of their own practice after they've carried out observations of a child in their industry placement, which becomes part of task 2A. And task 2B is where they must suggest how they could encourage and continue professional development to develop their own observational practice and skills. So again, that reflection is in relation to that observational practice and skills, not too generic and broad. What would they need to do? What CPD could they access and engage with to improve that? So we'll have a look as we go through the rest of this session at some activities that you could be doing with your students. So let's start by explaining how you could structure that reflection with your students and how you could build it in, how you could model it to them in the first place. So if we think about the different steps and stages of reflection, we've got reflect, plan, do and review. So the first stage would be to carry out a professional activity. So for your T-level students, one example could be the employer set project where there is a reflection task. So you might be doing a mock ESP, or you might be breaking it down into smaller chunks of learning for them to build on those skills they will require in the live assessment. So the ESP was to plan a support plan and then an activity plan. I'm sure by the time they get to the live window, you will have been bringing in scenarios from placements with your students that they could reflect upon. You could give them a placement task or activity to complete, or again, do a skills session with them in college. And you can use that as the basis of their reflection. So we start to get them to think what went well, what didn't work so well, what were the factors which impacted on how well everything went, how did their approach impact on success, so having a look at themselves. And you could also consider the involvement of others. Did they work well with others? Could they work better with others to improve outcomes? And reminding them that when they're reflecting, it's important to be objective, taking a step back and looking at what happened from the outside. So imagining they are an onlooker, not involved personally, and evaluate what happened and why it happened. And we'll look at an activity in the coming slides which can help them do that from that objective perspective, looking from the outside in. They might also ask for the input of others at this point. So that might be where they get that outside in. The professionals they've worked with, so they could get some feedback from their employer. If they were doing it in college, it could be feedback from their peers. It could be feedback from yourself, but definitely that perspective of others around them. Really thinking about who this might be to ensure that they gain input and feedback from the most relevant people, even those who might be difficult to ask. So we're building in that safe environment for them to ask everybody in their sort of tutor group. The next step or stage would be for them to use the findings of the reflection and evaluations to inform a plan of action. What might or will they do to address any issues? Will they change something or keep doing the things the way they were? Part of that reflection is we don't need to change everything just because we've been given feedback. We need to really critically analyse the feedback and our own actions and see how they sort of marry up together. It's important to teach as part of the do and the review that your students have personal justifications, particularly if they're not going to take on any of the feedback and they're not going to change anything. So are you teaching that justification? And that if they're not changing anything, focus on why this is so. And then for any areas where they will change things, what has informed the change? Why have they chosen those changes? So again, that justification. And even within those changes, being careful to think objectively here to have the best and most positive impact is why they would want to use those changes. So not just because someone says what they're doing was amazing. If they've received some ideas from others, again, it's important to model with your students to be objective and make a professional judgment of whether or not they're going to try them out. It can be quite difficult, particularly for the age range that the T-level students, to critically review their work and take what they will see as criticism from others. But using an objective, professional approach allows them to make informed choices, which will help to maintain high standards or improve to develop any areas. So one situation that you could do for a plan do review with your students to model that idea of looking at it objectively and not seeing it as a criticism, but from a professional approach, is to get them to sit with the different hats of the professions within the sector. So you might have the teacher who has one view and you could set the scenario. You might have the teaching assistant who has a different view. You might have the Senko who has a different view again. And you might have the parent. And really importantly, you might have the child as well that they're working with who has a different view. And that way your students get to see why it is so important for the profession they're going into. And it's not because it is a criticism, but it's that different professionals with different hats on and different roles and responsibilities will have different insight into support, activity, reports, views of behaviour, and that's a really good way to model that to your students. Okay, so once you've reflected on practice and made a plan, the next step or stage would be to put that plan into action. So it's important to review the changes you make and their impact, whilst also reviewing any areas which remain unchanged and how well they are going. So again, involving others. So this could be, if it is within a placement setting, they can do their activity, reflect on it, they have a plan for what they're going to change, and then they redo it. They go back into placement and redo it to see whether those changes improve the outcome. And then reviewing how well the whole process has gone with some more long-term planning of action. So this might be CPD, this might be working with others, they can set themselves some long-term goals. And the stages or steps here, as much as I've talked through them, it would appear in an order for sense making. The steps can be seen to overlap or even in a different order, but definitely in that cycle of reflection where there's no end to it really. And it's important to acknowledge that the reflective practice is very much an ongoing process without start and end points, and that the most successful professionals embed this into everything that they do. So how will your students benefit from reflective practice? We've sort of had a look at that already, and then you can maybe start to think about particular students. You might be able to identify them. You might be able to identify something in your own practice at the moment where you think, okay, we've talked through all of those stages. Where could I map some of these student benefits and start to get a plan of action for yourself? So the idea that the students can reflect on class sessions and will identify and improve on their own weaknesses, that you can provide productive feedback for yourselves as teachers. They might use a reflective learning diary. It can help to improve those problem solving and challenging, or skills of problem solving and challenging. And perhaps you've got a particular group of students or a particular area of the T level which is a challenge for them. So how can you start to build that reflective practice in and identify stages when that can almost become your teaching strategy? and particularly encouraging them to face and overcome their learning issues and problems. I think the really big one is to encourage the students to form learning groups so that peer feedback becomes part of normal practice. And it can also make that overall experience much more effective for your students. Learning groups are really effective for that peer forum to share thoughts, process new information and encourage interaction. So starting to get a little bit of a plan. So we'll just pause for a moment here from T-level students and where the reflection is in their model for our own reflective practice. So this model is taken from the EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation, and it's a model for teachers to reflect on their own practice of professional development. Adapted from Gibbs, which we'll come to in a minute, it's an opportunity to reflect on how effective professional development has been that you are going on. So we can use today as an example, or you can use any of the CPD sessions either received through myself or that you've been on as part of your T-level study would be a good starting point. And I share this because recommendation 2 of the EES Effective Professional Development Guidance Report, that was a mouthful, emphasises that any planned professional development activity needs to have a balanced approach. So it can't be overly knowledge heavy on new knowledge without opportunities to develop techniques in that area and embed practice, and vice versa. If it's just teaching techniques which embed practice but it's not building on any prior knowledge, then it would be ineffective as well. So the challenge for that balanced approach is embedding practice is key if we are to achieve a goal or sustain and consolidate change. I was very lucky in my professional career to go on lots of CPD, but thinking about this model, I do know that if I didn't through the actual CPD session itself or immediately after, take time to reflect on what I was going to do differently when I went back into the classroom, for me as the practitioner, but for my pupils as well, for my primary age pupils, or for other professionals in the class if I was leading on a particular subject or curriculum area. And I think this model on the screen can really support us to put those plans into action and embed practice. So what will you improve and how from the professional development that you're receiving, and what actions will be taken and by whom? And sometimes that means going back into our setting and asking for support of more people. Like I said, from a curriculum leader perspective, it wasn't just me who needed to embed those actions. So I needed an action plan which would engage everyone. Using this with your students, if you think about the different opportunities they've had on your T-level, perhaps they've gone to visit a different school setting, they might have gone to visit a Steiner school, for example. What have they learned from that professional development, and what are they going to put into practice, so that everything that you are doing with them is having an influence on the outcome of their professional development. If you are watching this on demand, you might want to pause the video and take a moment to work through those questions on the screen. As I said, from your T-level CPD today, or alternatively, taking this into one of your lessons with your students and modelling to them explicitly how you would reflect on your CPD, so that your students have got that experience, that scaffold, that then they could pick an area of their T-level study or professional development and they could complete this. And then you're starting to embed that with them into their everyday practice. And it's almost a reflective journal. Using a reflective journal can help ensure that the change we're looking to embed remains high on, if it's for us personally, teachers' to-do lists, but this can easily be applied to your students' to-do list. And that comes into that idea that I alluded to before of that self-regulation theory that suggests that this type of recording and self-monitoring process increases the likelihood that change becomes habitual. So helping to integrate it into routine and practice. And we must remember that we are that co-regulator to our students. So explicitly modelling reflective practice and coaching students is an important part of teaching the T level. Okay, so let's have a look at some models of reflection and specifically the ones which the qualification spec refers to. So we'll start with Kolb's. The first stage in this model is having the concrete experience, and generally this could be a planned or unplanned. We do something or carry out a work activity and we start off by describing what happened, which then takes us to the second stage. And this is where we reflect on what happened. We review the activity and carry out an objective review related to why we think the activity went the way it did, what influenced, what happened, what were the impacting factors relating to how successful it was. Did anyone else have any impact or provide feedback to you? And once this is completed, we then move to the next stage where we make links to other facts, knowledge and understanding that we have to make sense of the experience. That's what Kolb means by abstract conceptualization, and it's particularly important for something that's new. This learning involves using theories, logic and ideas rather than feelings to understand problems or situations. The final stage is to actively experiment with any new knowledge, learning or understanding gained from the whole process, and professionals can plan for the future regarding what they have gained from applying this reflective practice and how it informs their future practice. This is easy to relate to learning something new, but it can be just as beneficial to using an existing activity or practice to review its effectiveness or success. The second model is from Gibbs, reflective cycle, and there are 5 stages in this. Describing what happened, what were your feelings, evaluating why it happened and how you felt, and make conclusions and plan a course of action. So within a description of what happened, asking yourself after that description, what were my feelings and reactions and what was I thinking? How did this impact on the activity? Then into the evaluation of how good or bad the activity went, including, importantly, the why and how. Why it went good and how it went well, or why it wasn't so successful and how it wasn't so successful. And then the next stage relates to making conclusions, and that includes considering alternatives. What else could you have done? What could you have done differently? How might this have impacted on the activity? The final stage relates to planning a course of action based on the above step. What would you do differently if you carried out the activity again? Gibbs also suggests that you'd start the process again, that the next time you carried out the activity or a similar one, you'd start from the beginning, and it's that continuous cycle, which goes back to what we said right at the beginning, that reflection doesn't have a start and an end point. It's an ongoing journey. So the final model that is in the qualification spec is a reflective learning model. And it focuses on learning by reflecting on our own practice. So a reflective practitioner of any kind, can reflect on their own practice to better understand their activities and their background in order to improve what they do with their work responsibilities, if we're looking at it in that context. So returning to experience in this model is the basis of learning. It is necessary to return to review what happened, what you lived and experienced for further learning. Experiences should not be left behind and forgotten. And I think that's a good one, isn't it? That we're not just moving on to the next thing and forgetting about what we've done, that those experiences go with us into the next stage. So within this model, it's important to return mentally and review what happened, and that's the first step. So phase 2 has 2 aspects within this model, and it uses positive feelings and the removal of negative feelings that can be obstructing. So using positive feelings focuses on those emotions and feelings about the learning experience, which were positive and which are subject to reflection, therefore creating sort of an awareness of the environment in which it is taking place, and also seeing the benefits that are being generated from that experience and from the process of events that occurred. With sort of necessary attention given to feelings as part of the return experience, learners, people, ourselves, focus on the feelings and the emotions that are present. These feelings can enhance reflection and learning, and this will generate in the professional environment the motivation and desire to continue learning. Re-evaluation of the experience is the third step, and it's to take up the event and the attention of thoughts and feelings associated with it, which promote critical reflection because they allow us to change old ways of learning. The 4 key elements to reflecting and to re-evaluation are association, so relate new information to what we already have. Integration, to look for the relationship that the new information has with old. Validation, so determine the authenticity for the learner of the ideas and the feelings that have resulted. And then taking ownership, so making our own knowledge an essential part of operating all of the work. So that's 3 models we've had a look at that are within the qualification spec. Your students and yourselves might have a preferred model, but I think it's really important that they get to experiment with each of those and see which one naturally lends itself to them the most. So thinking about that, where your current thoughts are, take a moment. How could you begin to embed that reflection into your teaching of the T-level? Perhaps beginning with questions for the students as part of element 9 to introduce it. So, is learning possible in the face of self-evaluation of personal experiences? It might be something quite new to students. They might not believe in it at first. It might be something that really does need to be taught for them to see those benefits. Is it possible to put pedagogy into professional practice? That could be a question that you explore with your students, like a big lens question, which then you draw into the nitty-gritty of the qualification spec. Do they think they need to be aware of the work processes that are done, even if they're automatic and monotonous? So now let's expand on each of the knowledge points in a little bit more detail. So for knowledge point that we just had, 9.1, the students must understand the key concepts and follow models of reflection. We've explored those. You could set them a task using Gibbs reflective model to think of something that occurred on placement, a skills session, role play, and complete a reflective evaluation. You can see the questions there on the screen. Students should be introduced to reflective writing and models of reflection to aid in their understanding of what to include when writing reflectively, which will come into that task 4 of the ESP, remember. They need to avoid writing descriptively and ensure that they effectively evaluate their performance, including reflecting on what went well, what could be improved, and justification for further developments based on their own experiences. They also need to be able to reflect on their own performance against project aims and objectives, including strengths and limitations. They can also use the activity, which can be really useful for them when they are resitting exams. So if they do need to resit, what are they reflecting on, strengths and limitations as they go in so that they're well prepared. I did allude before to an activity which allowed them to sort of view it from somebody else's eyes, so that very objective view. If someone was watching in, and the activity on the screen is what you can use where you can give an object a voice. So thinking about that scenario we just did, which was the reflective writing journal on the previous slide, this one might help them get into that a little bit. Can they pick an object within the room, and what would that object say to them? And there's some questions on the screen. I am mindful of the age of T-level students, and they might find this a bit hard, and they might have a bit of a giggle at first if you ask them what the cup or the pen might have said. But again, this can explicitly be modelled to your students. So if you've got an activity in class, you could do it as a group task at first. What might one of the objects in the room have said about that lesson? For 9.3, students must understand the importance of receiving ongoing developmental feedback. This knowledge point really does go into supporting them in that ESP where they receive feedback and ongoing feedback. They'll receive feedback from yourself about their research notes, then they receive it from their peers, and then they've got to reflect at the end. So building it in so that your students understand why it's important. Have you given your students time to think of a moment when they were given feedback which had a positive impact? And sometimes we might not be stopping to think about how a feedback influenced a future outcome. How did they know that the feedback had a positive impact? Why did they give the feedback? So maybe they've given someone gave them some feedback. Why did they give them that feedback? And then getting them to appreciate it from the other person's point of view when they've received feedback, what action did they take, so that they can see both sides of the coin when it comes to that peer feedback in part 2, so that they make sure it's an enjoyable experience and purposeful for all the learners. And I think for that to happen and for it to be a positive, it's important to reflect on the ethos in your classroom and the dynamic of your students. So Timothy Clark, in his 4 stages of psychological safety, describes sort of a model of the 4 stages that teams can move through, progressing from 1 to 4. What would need to happen in your environment to allow that to grow? Arguably, students need to believe or feel safe to participate in peer and tutor feedback, that all of those stages are in place. So we've got that inclusion safety, that members feel safe to belong to the team, comfortable being present, do not feel excluded. Learner safety, that They're able to learn through asking questions, experimenting, and making and admitting mistakes and asking for help. That contributing their own ideas without fear of embarrassment, that is challenging, because volunteering your own ideas, as we know, creates a vulnerability, but that there's that safety that they feel that they can. So there's within those 4 stages. One of the activities that you could do with your students is start a new behaviour and then stop a behaviour. So for learner safety, assuming everyone is on the same page, you could stop assuming everyone is on the same page and start keeping a journal on positive interactions and how to improve next time. Collaborator safety, you can stop having a narrow view of success and start actively listening to others. Challenger safety, stop ignoring others' influences on our emotional state and start pinpointing stressful situations so that they become less of a surprise. Are activities that you could do with your students to help them to reflect on how that learning environment can become more enjoyable for everybody. So if you just think about 9.4, the students must understand how practitioners can meet their own developmental needs. This comes directly into that assignment for the EYE students to assignment 3. And it's that idea that students need to be self-directing their learning, reading and research. And can they have that experience to shadow and visit other settings, but are they also actively seeking that? Are they doing peer observations to learn from their friends? And are they setting and reviewing professional goals? So within that, this very much is about making the learners take ownership for it, but we must have modelled all the other steps before to support them, as it will be new. That they can learn from their placement employers. So what are some of their placement activities to just sit back and reflect at times and observe? Can they explore CPD platforms? So therefore you're on the screen, you've got Cash Alumni. It is a fantastic resource full of best practice, e-learning, events, podcasts, videos and articles. Are your students engaging in this as well and bringing that into both their knowledge within the classroom, but also their skills in placement? And there's also there as well placement objective templates, which might be something that you want to explore with your students for that setting and reviewing of professional goals. Are they identifying particular areas of the qualification spec which are explicitly relevant to their occupational specialism and seeking out further support? So can they research CPD? Can they actively find out how they can engage in it ongoing? Who to go to ask for it? How can we support them as practitioners? We can share our own CPD journey and we can model that to them and the impact that it has. Okay, and that brings me to the end of today's session. So hopefully you will feel that the session has achieved its intended purpose, that you've had some time for reflection today yourself. And so I just ask, if you think about right at the beginning, where is your confidence score and where is it now? And you can see that journey that you've been on. And if there is any reflection in there about potentially where it needs to go, then always get in touch with me and we can look at how that T-level CPD can further support you. We always welcome feedback for how sessions can be improved. So if you have got time to give that feedback, that would be greatly appreciated. And within that, you can also request access to NCFE's CPT platform and in the further comments within that form. So if you would like access to that, then please do so in your feedback form. And that just brings me to say thank you very much for attending, and I hope the session was purposeful.